and we are now recording. So officially welcome, John, and hello, Mary, and hello, everybody that's joining us today. And we're very happy to have you here today, taking the time this morning. And we are, as you know, recording this event, so it will be available later on. And for those of you that I haven't met before, my name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria. Before we do get underway, it's important to recognize that our members live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking First Peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And we gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish nations on whose traditional territories we are virtually meeting today. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with the CIC, because I know we do have some guests here today, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with an express mandate to engage Canadians on topics of international affairs. What makes us different from a lot of think tanks is that we have 17 branches across the country in all of our major cities, with some 1,400 members who are deeply involved and interested in Canada's role in the world. And you can find a lot more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council. And I'll also put my own email address up in the chat area. So if anybody wants to get in contact with me about membership, for example, we're always on the lookout for new members to support our programs. And we do offer complimentary student memberships as well here on Vancouver Island. So think about that. Now, so for our event today, our moderator is the Honorable Mary Collins. And just so you know, John will speak for about 35 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A. And for the Q&A portion, the question and answer portion, if you look down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A area where you can type your questions there, and we'll be looking there. So if you can just focus your questions in there, not in the chat, that will help us a great deal. And as mentioned, we are recording this event. So let's begin, and I'd like to start by welcoming John and Mary, but I'll start with introducing Mary. And now I know many of you watching us today know Mary, and Mary is our moderator, as I mentioned, and she was a member of Parliament for Capilano House Sound from 1984 to 1993. And she served during this period as Associate Minister of National Defense, Minister responsible for the status of women, and Minister of Health. Not all at the same time, but during that period. So a lot of important portfolios. She has also been involved in projects to support women in political life in Vietnam, Ukraine, and Mongolia, and spent 5 years living in Russia working on health policy issues. And here in Victoria, Mary is a very, very active she's very active on many, many boards, and also vice president of CIC Victoria. So Mary, thank you for being the moderator today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and welcome, John, and welcome to all those who are attending. It's a great turnout. We really appreciate it. Now, issues related to racism have certainly been in the headlines this past year in the US and Canada and even here in Victoria. And while much of the discussion has been about racism with respect to our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers, another aspect has been on the increase in racism with respect to our Asian populations, particularly since the onset of the COVID pandemic. So Canada and BC is not new to policies and actions respecting racism. And as Dr. John Price, our distinguished presenter, will discuss today, we have a very long and sad history of anti-Asian racism. We may not know, or we may prefer to forget the actions of our forefathers, and yes, they were mostly men, who instituted policies and practices that targeted our Asian population, but they are part of our history. So we are really pleased to have you, Dr. John Price, who is the Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Victoria, and share some of the extensive work that you have undertaken on this topic. And you have many publications, and you're recognized as one of the first scholars to focus on racism and foreign policy. You may have read about the numerous publications that John has that were outlined in the promotional material for today's seminar, but I won't reiterate them. But to get on with the show, because John is going to present us with his slides and thoughts for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then it'll be time to respond to your comments and questions. And as Chris has said, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So again, John, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Mary, and I'm honored to be invited to speak with you during part of Black History Month. I also want to say Gung Hagas Fat Choi, Happy Lunar New Year to all of you. One more day left in the holiday season. I'm joining you from South Vancouver, the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam and Hul'quami'num speaking peoples of the Lower Fraser. I come from a white settler family who took Kwantlen land near what is today called Langley over 100 years ago. I only began to understand what that means when I visited the Stalo Nation not far from the family farm about 10 years ago. It's a steep learning curve. I want to thank the Canadian International Council, our moderator, Mary Collins, and Chris Kilford, the Victoria CIC Chapter President, for hosting this session. Thank you. I particularly want to give a shout out to Daniel Townsend, the CIC Diversity Advisor, who suggested I be invited to speak. Apparently, while he was at the University of Toronto, he read an article I wrote 10 years ago on the Vancouver anti-Asian race riots. Only 10 people ever read that article, so a big shout out to you, Daniel, for reading it and for remembering it. I'd also like to raise my hands in recognition of the late Greg Donoghue, who for many years was the head of the historical section of Canadian External Affairs, as they used to call it. Greg and I differed in many of our interpretations of Canadian history. I was particularly unhappy when in reviewing my book, Orienting Canada, he began by saying, quote, "Canadians just don't write books like this." I sort of felt excluded, but we got over it and were in touch in this past spring before he passed away, when the first wave of COVID was hitting. I wrote him to ask if it was completely off the wall to think of a swap of Mungwanjo for the two Michaels as a humanitarian gesture. And he replied as follows, quote, "I'm not sure if it's entirely off the wall. Chrétien made a similar suggestion, but for a straight up trade a few months back. A trade on humanitarian grounds might be possible, although it would not solve the underlying problems, at least on the Canadian side. One of the problems, as you note, is our southern neighbor. And here, the issue is simply that I doubt anyone in Ottawa would feel comfortable in predicting the White House's reaction. He, meaning Donald Trump, could ignore such an exchange, he could welcome it, or he could invade Vancouver Island. Washington's unpredictability accounts for the gingerly approach to closing the Can-Am border. Let me know if you need any help." I'm going to refer to Greg's views during this presentation, not to kick him when he can't defend himself, but because he had some important things to say. And in a recent article, David Webster suggested that Greg was rethinking indigeneity and beginning to talk about Canada Indigenous relations as foreign relations. That is extremely pertinent to our session today. In this presentation, I'm going to try and reconcile what I wrote in Orienting Canada over a decade ago with what I have been researching recently that is about to be published this Thursday. Could you show the next slide? So this is the publication. It was a deep dive into BC history with authors that I worked with, a fabulous group of authors. You may not be able to read their names there, but they are from an array of Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. And this booklet, it's 80-page, fabulously illustrated by the graphic designer John Endo Greenaway. It will be available to download for free beginning at noon on Thursday, February 25th. And the website to get this publication is called Challenge Racist BC, one word.ca. So if you Google that, you'll get on Thursday afternoon, you should be able to download the booklet. It's free of charge and will be widely available. So I'm going to focus on 5 moments or stories that I hope will open up some important conversations today and into the future. So talking about, first one is talking about anti-Asian racisms. When and where did they start? Was it the race riots? Was it the head tax? My choice is 1872 in BC. There, First Nations and racialized peoples, Chinese, Black, and mixed race peoples, were by far the majority, numbering around 40,000 compared to fewer than 10,000 Europeans. The small group of 20 white male legislators elected in 1871 were anxious to expand their electoral support since voting regulations restricted voting only to propertied men who were literate. Enlarging the number of voters brought up the question of race. In the 1872 legislative debate on removing the literacy and property requirements to vote, one legislator expressed his fears succinctly. Quote, "We might, after next election, see an Indian occupying the speaker's chair or have a Chinese majority in the House." The legislators resolved their racial anxiety by removing the literacy and property qualifications, thereby expanding the number of white voters, men, and then inserted unlucky Article 13 that's highlighted in this slide. Nothing in this act shall be construed to extend to or include or apply to Chinese and Indians. In passing this election law, the legislators allowed white men, regardless of property or literacy levels, to vote, but they disenfranchised more than 80% of the people of the province, including all women. Few histories of BC fully explore the details or implications of this legislation. For the story only begins with the passing of the legislation. Some people look back at this period and surmise that it was just the way things were. Everyone was racist back then. In fact, that wasn't the case, and there were objections to the legislation even at the time. The then premier of the province, J.F. McCreight, refused to allow the bill to stand. He reserved it and sent it to Ottawa because, he said, it seemed wrong to limit voting based on nationality, race, or color. It also contravened imperial instructions to avoid limiting the rights of non-Europeans in a way that violated international treaties, and it violated federal jurisdiction over Indigenous affairs when the Indian population of the province amounted to 50,000 souls. In Ottawa, it was examined, the bill was examined by none other than John A. Macdonald, Prime Minister and simultaneously his own Minister of Justice, who dismissed McCreight's objections and ordered that this terrible bill receive royal assent that October. Macdonald and the federal government had acted decisively to bolster white supremacy on the Pacific. In the words of the Daily Colonist at the time, the new law brings within the pale of the electoral franchise every bona fide resident British subject who takes the trouble to register. It also, by explicit words, excludes Indians and Chinese. Here, indeed, is a great and important victory for the Liberal Party in the House. This domination of a white minority would continue for the next 70 years, with citizens of Japanese and South Asian descent added to the list of excluded others in 1895 and 1907, respectively. White women won the vote in 1917, but Indigenous and Asian Canadian men and women remained disenfranchised at a very great cost to them and their families. What the BC legislators over the objections of McCreight had done with John A. Macdonald's support was to reach back into the era of US slavery to bring in this unjust law. Because in the United States, after the Civil War ended in 1865, this is 7 years before this law was passed, Congress had passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed that African-American voting rights could not be denied, and I'm quoting, or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. To put it quite plainly, BC legislators approved and imposed this racist legal statute at a time when the federal and state governments in the US were specifically prohibited from doing so. In effect, BC's white legislators had, by denying the rights of citizenship to First Nations and Chinese, turned back the clock and brought slavery-era laws into the province of BC. BC in 1872 was on the way to becoming a province like no other. Next slide, please. Well, normally we went back to 1872, which marks a sort of an important beginning of anti-Asian legislation and racism. I'm actually taking us further back, and I apologize. It may lead to some consternation because we would like to catch up to what's happening today at some point. However, I think this is very important to sort of go back a little bit further. So this is a letter written by Henry Howe on May 8th, 1845. He wrote it to the British Colonial Secretary in London. Why am I looking at this? Last June, in the midst of the global anti-racist upsurge, June Francis of the Hogan's Alley Society, a group dedicated to promoting Black history in Vancouver, said in a CBC interview, "We need our white brothers and sisters to really own this, because it's a problem of white supremacy, of putting one group and their needs at the center of a system that has worked only because it has dominated others." Her words resonated, and I went back to rediscover the incredible works of Gerald Horne of the University of Houston, author of over 30 books on Black history. Horne reminds us in The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism that white supremacy in the United States was never solely targeted at African Americans. Native Americans were the first victims. Racism was never aimed solely at Chinese or at Asians. Its first targets were indigenous. And this is where this letter comes in. Howell writes, I quote from the beginning of his letter, "During the period of 11 years, from 1831 to 1842, the subscriber was a resident of the United States, though not a citizen, and for nearly the whole of that time was actively engaged in the anti-slavery contest. He was an abolitionist. This gave him an opportunity of forming what he's called a tolerably correct opinion of the Anglo-Saxon race there, and of obtaining some knowledge of the Aborigines of that country, their sufferings, their privations, and their patient endurance." And then he got to the point. "The Oregon Territory, as your lordship doubtless knows, is occupied by about 150,000 Indians who inherit it from their ancestor, to whom, therefore, it rightfully belongs, and not in equity to either of the nations claiming the same." He concluded by politely suggesting that the British government relinquish their claim to the Oregon Territory in favor of the American Indians. As it turns out, the British Colonial Secretary ignored this advice and, with the United States, signed what is today known as the Oregon Treaty. That is usually only referred to as a border defining treaty. Next slide, please. It was, in fact, a unilateral seizure of the Pacific Northwest lands from the 150,000 sovereign indigenous peoples that inhabited them. It also drew the border along the 49th parallel that we know today as indicated by this map. On what basis did the British Colonial Secretary repudiate Howell and justify the seizure of the Pacific Northwest? He did so on the basis, he said, that Captain Cook, Captain Vancouver, Alexander Mackenzie and David Thompson had discovered British Columbia. This justification is what is referred to today as the doctrine of discovery, denounced by everyone from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the United Nations and elsewhere as a racist doctrine. Yet, Canadian courts today, including the Supreme Court of Canada, have ruled that this treaty is the basis for Crown sovereignty over the lands that we now call British Columbia. In so ruling, they are reproducing and imposing colonialism and the doctrine of sovereignty, the doctrine of discovery on these lands once again. Given this continuing colonialism and genocide that has historically accompanied it, perhaps we need rescuing. Perhaps there is a country out there that should invoke the responsibility to protect and come and rescue us. On a more serious note, Howe's letter clearly denouncing the proposed seizure of the Pacific Northwest illustrates an alternate view of the world, one that British leaders were aware of, but because of the racist superiority complex, were incapable of accepting. Instead, they erased 150,000 Indigenous people and caused untold damage that continues to this day. Next slide, please. All right, now we are going to flash forward, try to get up into a date that closer to this one. So what is significant about this, about Churchill's March 5th, 1940 speech in Fulton, Missouri? This is the picture of Churchill giving that speech. He was out of power, and beside him sitting is President Truman. In his review of Orienting Canada 10 years ago, Greg Donoghue concluded that as good as my earlier chapters on pre-war Canadian foreign policy might have been, my interpretation and quote, I quote, of post-war Canadian policy in Asia is not persuasive. Having turned its back on the Pacific in 1907, it was hardly surprising that Canada's post-war interests remained concentrated on in the North Atlantic. In particular, most Canadians embraced their closest neighbor and richest trading partner, the United States, with which they shared a common set of liberal, cultural, economic, and political values. I'd like to focus on this assertion and examine it carefully. It's on one level not wrong, but in fact, it actually conceals much more than it reveals. What is it concealing? Next slide, please, Chris. In saying Canada turned its back on the Pacific, we see a form of nationalist personification of the state. We are invited to align ourselves with Canada, but states are not people. They are laws and policy, usually backed up by military force. Canada did not turn its back on the Pacific. Canadian members of Parliament adopted racist policies that presented settlers from Asia coming to Canada. Formulations like Canada turned its back erases racism and its devastating impacts on Indigenous people and on Asian Canadians and others. And it avoids the hard facts of racism. Here's one illustration of that. These are the population statistics for British Columbia from pre-contact times from 1780 to 2016. On the left, the red line column is the percentage of Indigenous people. They constituted 100% of the population. What we see happening to Indigenous people is the drastic reductions. And as one historian puts it, until the point they were nearly snuffed out, reduced to about 25,000 people from anywhere from 175,000 to 200,000 people. On the other hand, the blue line escalates sharply right up to the middle and up until 1971. Those are white settlers. The gray line, the blue line represents Chinese and other racialized communities. We see a slight increase up to 1901 and then decreases as a percentage of the population. And the orange is the small Black population that was also largely decimated by everyday racism and immigration restrictions. So that's the result of the immigration laws. It's not a result of Canada turning its back. Canada still wanted the trade from Asia, just as it still wants the trade from Asia today. Next slide, please, Chris. This is the statistics regarding immigration from 1946 to 1953. Here we get a contrast. On the one hand, Canada prides itself as bringing in many people, including refugees, after World War II from Europe, but it shut its doors to the refugees and immigrants from Asia. Here's an indication, tens of thousands from Europe and hundreds, limited to hundreds from other countries. These policies were in fact anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-Asian racism that resulted in a white Canada, or in the language that's used in this phrase earlier, most Canadians. So when we use that phrase, most Canadians, we can't forget what that is actually saying. We can't forget the racism, the exclusions, the discrimination that affected so many people for so long, and simply say, well, that's the way it was. Now for the second part of the critique, that most Canadians embraced the United States with whom they shared a common set of liberal, cultural, economic, and political values. Well, what were those values? That takes us back to Churchill and his 1946 speech, which of course is known for Churchill's statement that from Stettin to the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. What most histories do not talk about, and what struck me a decade ago when I was writing Orienting Canada, and which is even more pertinent today, is his statement in that same speech: if the population of the English-speaking Commonwealths be added to that of the United States, with all that such cooperation implies in the air, on the sea, all over the globe, and in science and in industry, and in moral force, there will be no quivering, precarious balance of power to offer its temptation to ambition or adventure. This was a call for a reinvigorated Anglo-American global alliance, a race-based alliance of Britain and the historic settler states. And I contend that it was the racist foundations of the liberal cultural, economic, and political values that I referred to earlier. But when counterposed to communism, it could parade as liberalism. It may be difficult for white Canadians to see this, but for others in the world, it's not so hard. Next slide, please, Chris. This is a photo of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru leaving the Canadian House of Commons after his address to Parliament in October 1949. Over the next 2 years, as the countries previously at war with Japan haggled over a peace treaty, he would articulate a path to a non-aligned world, one that Canada rejected. On August 23, 1951, Nehru sent a telegram to the United States government in which he categorically opposed the US peace treaty proposal to end the state of war with Japan. The telegram was very explicit regarding the reasons for Nehru's rejection of the proposed treaty that was being negotiated then. One, he considered that the provisions giving the US control of Okinawa and the adjacent Bonin Islands were not justifiable. Two, the military provisions of the treaty and the security treaty to be signed between the US and Japan should only be concluded after Japan became fully independent. Three, Formosa, Taiwan should be returned to China at once. And four, India objected to the fact that the peace treaty deliberations to be held in San Francisco in 1951 would not allow for negotiations of the treaty. American officials and Truman were stunned by the news since they had anticipated India's participation. The Indian reply provoked Truman to scribble in the margins of the Indian note, "Evidently, the government of India has consulted Uncle Joe and Mousy Dung of China." The racism of Truman, in which he converts Mao's name to mouse excrement while using a term of endearment for Stalin, whom he had met, needs to be kept in mind as we explore this post-war world. The upshot of the US so-called peace proposals was that the countries most affected by the war in Asia were effectively excluded from the peace treaty. China, including Taiwan, was not even invited to the peace conference. Neither were the Koreas, North or South. India refused to participate in what was effectively a rigged affair, as did Burma. 3 signatories from Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, were in effect representatives of the French colonial regime, backed by Canada, we should say, and have to be excluded from any count of Asian endorsements. That leaves only 4 Asian countries: the Philippines, Indonesia, Ceylon, and Pakistan. Of these 4, Indonesia signed the treaty but never ratified it and signed a separate peace treaty with Japan. The Philippines, although closely allied with the United States, reserved its signature and did not ratify the treaty until after it had gone into effect. In other words, the only Asian countries that effectively supported the San Francisco Peace Treaty were Pakistan and Ceylon, both recent colonies of Britain, and neither of which had signed the Allied Declaration of 1942, which was the basis upon inviting signatories for this treaty. This was a racist treaty dominated by the Anglo-American allies, including Canada, who played no small part in promoting this treaty that left untold territorial issues unresolved and that are today hotspots of regional tensions. In the end, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was only peripherally a peace treaty, however. New slide, please. It was accompanied by the signing of a series of bilateral and multilateral military pacts that ensured the Pacific would become an American lake, an ambition that dates from the early 20th century, particularly 1898, when the United States illegally annexed Hawaii. The United States, by the treaties and military agreements it signed, would retain over 200,000 troops in Japan alone, not to mention thousands more in Okinawa, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and as the decade continued, in Vietnam. It was an empire-building exercise to confront China as an independent power. It continues to this day, only now it is morphing into what is known as the Quad, the US, India under Modi, and Australia and Japan. India's Nehru articulated a different path in 1951, but Pearson ignored him, failing even to apprise cabinet of the problems with the treaty that officials in external affairs had alerted him to, studiously refraining from even letting the cabinet know what those problems were. Next slide, please, Chris. This is Dakota Holmes and her dog Cato. We're at 2020. She was walking Cato in a Vancouver park when her allergies made her sneeze. What happened next is almost unbelievable. A white man came up to her and punched her in the face while yelling racist slurs about Asian people and COVID-19. Cato chased the assailant away. Dakota Holmes is an Indigenous woman. Her father, Don Baines, is the former executive director of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And in a news release condemning the attack, Dakota stated, "I'm sharing my story to get the message out that that racism is a deadly and sobering threat, and every single instance of racism must be addressed and called out by all of us so that it stops. Although the attacker thought I was Asian at first, I yelled out that I was Indigenous, and he still didn't stop and didn't seem to care. As an Indigenous woman," Dakota says, "I'm acutely aware that sexism and racism, often intersecting, are part of my life, and I never take chances on my safety." Dakota Holmes is not the only one fearing for her safety. I am hearing daily from friends and colleagues in Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities about fears that they have. The pandemic is revealing deep fissures in our society, deeper in some ways than even those in the United States. Next slide, please, Chris. According to Project 1907, a grassroots initiative working with Vancouver Asian Film Festival and others, Canada has a higher number of anti-Asian racism reports per capita than the US. BC has proportionally more than California. Women are impacted more, 60% of all incidents. In BC, it's 70%. Nearly 30% of reported incidents are assault, including targeted coughing, spitting, and physical attacks and violence. Last week, the Vancouver Police Department reported that hate crimes had increased 97% between 2019 and 2020. Anti-Asian hate crimes incidents rose by 717% in the past year. These numbers vastly underestimate the actual number. Next slide, please, Chris. Today, fear is stalking racialized communities. In November last year, a group of 552 people of East and Southeast Asian heritage signed an impassioned letter to Trudeau. It is an incredible plea for sanity in our relations with China. They have never made the letter public because they fear to do so would open them up to being labeled pro-China, spies for China, communists, or any other of the many slurs already being slung their way. This is a community that, with Indigenous and Black community, has been fighting racism over a century. And today it is being silenced by racism that dates not from COVID. It dates from 1870, and it dates from 3 years ago when the Globe and Mail publishes this type of front page picture of a dragon consuming the city of Vancouver. Xenophobia has become endemic with the pandemic. Increasingly, the atmosphere is starting to resemble another period in history. Next slide, please, Chris. This is a photo, 1900s, in which British Columbia is being swarmed and appealing to the Laurier, the Prime Minister, for help. It's about immigration. But out of that one came all the racism directed towards Japanese Canadians that ended, culminated in their uprooting, incarceration, dispossession, and exile. That's the mood that's being created today. And unfortunately, some politicians are taking advantage of divisions in Chinese communities related to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, or the Uyghurs to promote hatred of China. It is part of a long history of Orientalism, painting the East as despotic against a supposed liberal West, a powerful and racist Anglo-American empire that has dominated the globe for the past century and has engaged in atrocious acts of barbarity, leading to the deaths of 6 million people in Vietnam and South Korea and in Korea. Yet those seem to be forgotten. Racism we are seeing today threatens to derail the global fight against the pandemic and the urgent need to confront the climate emergency. Failure to bring together the peoples as well as countries of the world to meet these challenges is not an option. I suggest we all get down to work. White folks need to step up and support and learn from Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities in every way. Our lives and the lives of our children depend on it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, John. That's wonderful. Yeah. That's been quite a wonderful presentation indeed. Now we've got a couple of questions. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Mary.
Okay, good.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. The first one is from James, and could you respond, please? I think you did mention this, to the reported 700% increase in anti-Asian attacks, hate crime during the last year. Are British Columbians guilty of continued systemic racism? Is there a way to improve society?
I don't think we can, we have to distinguish between those who act out those acts of aggression, those hate crimes. There are those who are very much opposed and have intervened to try and stop them, who are white folks. But there are still way too many bystanders, people who don't think it's really their business. The problem we have is that too often I feel that we look at racism as a question of individuals. Oh, is that person racist? Is that person racist? You know, it's really a wrong way of going about this question. It's not what we're supposed to be doing. What we need to be doing is looking at the institutions of our society, the systemic racism that has infiltrated all those institutions, and find ways to transform those institutions. So it's a complex process. It's got to be on the agenda of everybody, every institution, the government, but also the myriads of public and private bodies, all of which have so much to do. We all have so much to do to deal with this problem, and I do feel that it's quite urgent, especially with the problem of xenophobia that's developed in British Columbia and in Canada today.
Great, thank you. And we've got a number of comments back about how great this presentation was. It's really, really great. But Erin would like to know, do you have any thoughts as to why this history is still so undercovered in BC and elsewhere in Canada, specifically in our K-12 schools? That was my question as well.
Well, we're hoping that the new publication that we've just put out, that's coming out on Thursday, Challenging Racist British Columbia, 150 years, will help with that. The problem is that the people, the stories of racism and the history of racism, and more importantly, and what we do, I hope, in this new publication, is provide a history of anti-racism in this province. Because there have been people fighting this from contact on. And what we do in the new resource is honor those people and tell about the struggles that they've waged. The problem is that our histories that have been written, some authors have been fabulous, including Jean Barman, who's written so many stories about racialized communities, fabulous stories, fabulous work. However, they have not been put in to a context in which race is clearly identified. And so too often, for instance, the 1872 legislation is described as the beginning of representative government in British Columbia. That's a whole discussion, but how can we talk about 1872 that enlarged the franchise for some men and took away the right to vote of 80% of the population, using laws that echo slavery in the United States? How can we describe that as representative government? So that's, the legacy historians, have fought to try and change things, but, our provincial governments and other powers have not been willing to allow this discussion. And I raise my hands to the Black Lives Matter movement and the other anti-racist movements, the anti-racist uprising that's occurred over the last year, because it's now opening doors that have actually needed to be opened many years ago.
Yeah, great. Now, a couple of people have asked about the launch of your book, Challenging Racist BC History, coming out on Thursday. Is there going to be a virtual launch or anything connected with it that people can go to?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's going to be, first of all, the launch is going to be through the activating the website challengeracistbc.ca, where people will be able to go and obtain and download the new publication for free. So that's the first step. And then in March, we will be doing a Zoom launch in association probably with March 21st, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Racism, United Nations Day. And so we will be having a Zoom launch within the next couple of weeks. And so we'll definitely be letting people know about that. It will be advertised on the website and elsewhere. And we're looking forward to partnering with a large number of organizations to actually do this launch.
Great. Well, I know there's going to be a great deal of interest in that. And as people know, we are recording this session, so it'll be available in a little while, and some of that information will be available that way as well. We have a great number of questions coming in here. One of them is, the current media is biased, one-sided, and destructive against Canada-China relations, hence inciting the xenophobia to continue and grow. What can be done about that? Please comment.
So the suggestion is that it's the Canadian government that's promoting this?
I don't know. Are they?
Yeah. Could you repeat the question again?
Sure. It says the current media is biased, one-sided, and destructive against Canada-China relations, hence inciting the xenophobia to continue and grow. What can be done about it?
Thanks. I was wondering what the focus was. And so the question is the media and the biases in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the biases in the media, definitely, and it's not a simple one, and there are changes going on in the media. And, you know, there's lots of new reporters coming on stream that are wonderful, and they're trying to do a good job. But it is, you know, the nature of our media. A number of problems arise. Number one, the fact that the people who are in control of the media either do not agree with the anti-racist upsurge and may be silent in the face of it and not openly criticizing it, but filter the news so that some minimal news is given, like 700% increase in hate crimes. But there's not the in-depth look at, or the retraining of newspapers or TV, other forms of media, in order that they be brought up to speed with the questions that we've addressed in this thing. So I think education with the media is very important. There's no doubt that some of the media, corporate media, the private ownership of the media, does also have an effect because of their interests, and it depends on which way they see themselves. And so, yeah, biases of all sorts, very complicated issue in terms of overcoming that bias in the media. And I think that there are lots of reporters out there, and social media is helping us to get over that bias. Reporters like Angela Sterritt, Joanna Chu, and many others are, you know, doing things that had never been done before. And so, yeah, we're beginning to see a change.
Now, John, you know that in BC, Premier Horgan has announced that there's going to be new anti-racism legislation introduced during the next little while. And I just wondered what advice you would have for him and the government. What should be included in that, or how should it be done?
Well, I think that some of the steps that have been announced, the appointment of Rakhna Singh as parliamentary secretary, the proposal to have legislation related to collecting race-based data, the anti-racist law, the coming to an agreement with Japanese Canadians for the BC role in their uprooting and dispossession. All of these things are positive steps forward. But I would say, I guess my only word of caution is this, that the BC government today is the inheritor, it's the successor government of all these governments that perpetrated racism and white supremacy for over a century. And the question of Indigenous land is very, very important. You cannot simply see this as a question simply of attitudes. The question of even the legitimacy of the BC government is in question, given that the courts have said its only basis of legitimacy is the Treaty of Oregon. That's a problem, and they need to address that problem. And they also have to provide full disclosure of the role of the provincial government. For example, you know, there's a well-known rehabilitation or long-term care facility known as the George Pearson Center. That name comes from a provincial minister who is actually one of the leaders in bolstering white supremacy and leading to the injustices that occurred towards Japanese Canadians. That's something that the provincial government, they don't know. We know the accusations of racism at the Royal BC Museum are extremely serious. So the government needs to fully divulge and its own history, which it has yet to do. Secondly, it has to avoid thinking that it can come up with solutions on its own. The people who have been fighting racism, the Indigenous peoples, their organizations, anti-racist organizations, heritage organizations, museums have been fighting to deal with these issues for decades. They often remain unfunded, unheard. And so the provincial government needs to provide the resources necessary so that these groups can fully participate in any proposed legislative changes on the issues at hand.
All right. Very good advice, John, to you. And I think it sort of references to some of the other questions we have as well. We'll just probably have time for a couple more. How are we going to ensure the institutions or systems who seem to be discovering systemic racism, again, to enter the next phase of institutional work with the historical and social context that you just so powerfully illustrated?
And so how are we going to do that? First part of that question again? I need to
how are we going to ensure that the institutions or the systems which seem to be discovering systemic racism again, you know, all the things that are happening, to enter into the next phase of work with the historical and social context that you have powerfully illustrated?
Well, I think it's going to be up to the various groups, the Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities to organize and to get that happening. And I think that there's, you know, there's so many fabulous organizations out there that I've, you know, had the privilege of either working with or be made acquainted with. Project 1907, the Pacific Canada Heritage Center, Museum of Migration folks, Chinese Canadian Historical Society of British Columbia. All these organizations are out there doing the work day to day, and they need to be empowered and brought in and empowered. The problem is that, you know, and what's happening from my understanding in many Indigenous communities now is that they're, you know, the changes that have occurred have meant that there's increasing amount of consultation. Many questions about the nature of that consultation and how legitimate or genuine that consultation is. But the impact on Indigenous communities is all of a sudden, they're inundated with requests for this, that, and the other thing. People want to consult with them every day, but they don't have the resources to do that. All of it, 150 years, 200 years of colonialism, all of a sudden they're being listened to, and yet this is, and so they have to be given the ability, the resources to take these things on, as do other groups that need to be involved in the process. So I think the pressure has to be put on them by these groups. I hope that, increasing organization takes place. There's more, association and federative groups that are formed that bring together anti-racist and organizations that are fighting for LGBTQ rights, for disabled rights, that they're coming together to, to put forward an agenda that will make the difference necessary to get institutions in line.
Great, yeah. Well, that's great. Before we go, I do just want to read out the comment from Kelly Lee, who says, "Thank you, John, for presenting what is largely an untold story for most Canadians, but one that is close to our family history. Our late father, Monty Lee, was Canadian born, but not permitted to have Canadian citizenship. He fought in the Second World War along with hundreds of Asians and Indigenous people in Canada, despite being unrecognized as citizens and disenfranchised. I recommend a visit to the Chinese Canadian Military Museum and the displays organized by the wonderful Catherine Clement, if anyone would like to learn more about this history. Asians have not just been passive benefactors, but active contributors to building Canada." I thought that was a lovely comment, John, and you may want to have a comment on it as well.
No, I think there's so many stories out there. And I think our challenge now is to acknowledge those stories, to hear those stories, and to make sure that they're brought in as part of the anti-racist initiatives that are going on around us.
Well, I think it is time to thank you, to say goodbye. First of all, to thank all those who have been involved today and listened and watched. It's been just so enlightening and so interesting, John. We are very fortunate to have someone like you who is sharing your expertise. And I know many of those today and many others will be looking forward to the launch of your book on Thursday. That's going to be very interesting. And I gather you also have another book coming out, Beyond White Supremacy, Race, Ingenuity, and Pacific Canada as well. So lots to come and lots to be thankful for. And thank you again. Hopefully to everyone that you'll continue. We've got many other virtual events coming up, and I don't know, Chris, if you want to have anything final to say as well.
Yeah, I do, Mary. You may have seen me waving there. John and Mary, could we just stay on the line for a little longer, and also with our guests as well, because we were quite overwhelmed with the number of questions that came in, and also with the number of bits of information flowing through the chat channel. And I had a couple of other questions. So John, can you stay with us and everybody? Yeah, okay. Mary, are you
good.
Okay?
Yep,
so
I'm fine.
Let's carry on for 10 more minutes, because it's such, obviously, we knew this anyway, but this has made it clear to us that this is a very important subject, and we need to just maybe continue for 10 more minutes. John, you wrote back in 2013, you were talking about Eurocentrism in our education system. And you spoke about a study that was done by Simon Fraser University that 85% of our historians at universities here in the country still focus on European or American history, and that 85% of the world's population's history remains on the periphery. Now, that was roughly 10 years ago. Has anything changed in our educational world? Are we beginning to focus more on other people's histories?
Yeah, there are changes going on. There are some positive steps in the educational system, but it is, a big challenge that needs to be met with, a broad array of means and views in order to deal with them. because you know, for instance, in a history department, you get a history department that grows up in a certain way, and it has, you know, 30 professors, you know, who come out of traditional sort of, you know, areas of work, which is like, you know, European history and American history or Canadian history, and they become embedded and they do their work, and many of them do great work. But the problem is that once there and a department develops a certain profile as having experts in these fields, it requires a lot of work and resources in order to go beyond that. So, you know, if you have a department of 30 people, that's still 80% European or Euro white oriented. How do you bring in the other 80%? Can you double the faculty numbers and, you know, have an equal number that would bring it up to snuff? Theoretically, you could, but the money is not there, right? You know, that would require doubling the education budget for universities. And so that's a huge challenge. And so what we're seeing is some incremental changes. You know, universities are bringing in new voices. And so we see a lot more Indigenous faculty, or at least some more, not a lot, but more, certainly a lot more than in the past. Still a very small number that needs to be increased. And same thing for other sectors. And, you know, so it's a big challenge to change how education is delivered and make sure that we have the expertise to deliver the programs and education necessary to assure that we have the broad coverage and that you know, the world is represented and not just local interests.
Another issue that we see here, of course, is there are a lot of books available now that speak about the role of the communist, the People's Republic, what am I trying to say here? The Communist Party of China. And we always try to differentiate between the people of China and the Communist Party in China. But we have a number of books that are in circulation in Canada, internationally, where it's pointed out that they are having quite an influential role in the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora. I guess it's difficult for Canadians who then read about what is happening, what the Chinese government is doing, and then it's sort of giving them an impression. Are these books accurate? Is there concern? What would you say there?
You know, I'm not aware of the specific books that you're referring to, so I can't give you, you know, an opinion on that. I mean, I think that, you know, I have lots of books that come out of China, and many of them are great books. Of course, the Communist Party of China is its own being. I have my own opinions of what has happened to the Communist Party of China, and that's for another day, perhaps. But you know, we can say that we do have to remember that the Communist Party of China gained control of China because it was popular. Not to say it was popular with everybody. Big landlords didn't like it. But it was popular with the peasants, and that was the basis for it coming to power. There's a historical consensus about that. I mean, in power, things change, of course. This party that was out of power and gained a lot of popular support, you know, had to deal with itself as a party in power, and things happened. So, you know, a Communist Party changes. You know, so this is not like, in speaking to one of my colleagues, Wu Guoguang, who is, you know, a very important political scientist who used to be a secretary to Zhao Ziyang, and has written a huge amount of material critical of China and the Communist Party. also says, I think what, I don't know what the number is right now, but it's, I think 40 million members of the Communist Party in China. Well, that's the population of Canada. We can't dismiss the population of a country that size, 40 million people, even in the party, as imbeciles or anything else, right? They are what they are, and we have to treat them as people. And they may have different views, but that's only natural. Given that China, from 1945 on, has been encircled by the United States and the Anglo-American alliance militarily, right? Put yourself in the situation that they're in when you had, say, in 1930, Japan, sitting off the coast of, or occupying Vancouver Island, and forces that aren't friendly to us surrounding our seas. Look at the reaction when Charles de Gaulle came to Quebec, and I forget what year it was, 1960 something, and talked about Vive le Québec libre, right? The reaction to that in Canada was what? Right? In Quebec, it was like, yay, right? In the rest of Canada, it was like, who the hell are you to come in here? And, and he got basically trounced and told to get out of the country, right? So we have to be really careful about projecting and assuming that our views represent truth, right? And that their views represent untruth. That's no way that we can conduct international affairs.
Thank you for that, and we definitely have a great exchange going on in the chat area, which is it's refreshing to see. One final area that I'd like to explore with you is that we have seen a remarkable change in where people are coming from these days to Canada and even the United States. I was looking at the United States immigration figures, and the majority of people are coming from Asia. The same here is true. So do you see, obviously the country's changing. I mean, this country's always changed as waves of immigrants have come in from all over the place. Where do you see Canada in 10 years?
I don't make any predictions because I think we're in a moment here that's quite pivotal. I really am concerned about the climate emergency. If we can't get on top of that globally, and that means Canada as well, look what happened down in Texas recently, right? All of these things that we're facing with COVID, the problems of racisms and divisions, and those things are going to come out every time we hit these various crises, right? Whether it be climate crisis or pandemics. So I think it's really hard to predict where we're going to go. I hope that we can move quickly and there can be some really, big changes made relatively quickly, but that's, usually not the way things work. So,
yeah. Okay, we'll leave it at that. John, thank you so much for today. And Mary for also moderating. We obviously generated a lot of questions and a lot of chat back and forth, which is one of the reasons we do this. We don't do this just to have an event and then walk away from it. We like to get that conversation going. And for everybody that has asked, we will make sure for all the registrants and the attendees that we email you where the link is to this presentation, where any other links are to the book and the book launch and so forth. And I'll work with John to make that happen. And if you're still with us, other CIC events are coming up, CIC Victoria events in particular. We're going to be looking at our intelligence services in this country. We're going to be looking at the Kennedy family as well. We have 11 UVic students that will be taking part in a virtual UN conference in New York, a model UN conference representing Gabon. So they're getting ready for that. And then we're looking at a Syria panel where we're going to look at the Syrian refugee crisis from the moment people cross the border, let's say into Turkey, into Greece, and end up here in Victoria. So we have a lot of exciting events coming up. And if you are not a member of CIC and you'd like to become one, get in contact with us because we're always happy to have you as members. And so on that note, John, Mary, everybody, have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye.